these negotiables, these warehouse receipts, were being treated as if they were cash, but they were not cash. Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk about the Great Salad Oil Scandal, a very interesting commodities futures scam perpetrated by Anthony DeAngelis and his Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Company. These are the things we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the scammer and the scam. We'll talk about the context. We'll talk about the particular unethical acts and what caused those things. We'll talk about what the fallout from this event was, what lessons accounting learned in general, and why this might matter to me. The Great Salad Oil Scandal was the brainchild of Anthony DeAngelis, also called Tony. He lived his life in a very interesting way. That's him pictured on the right side there. Left high school to work in a meat plant to support his family. After a while, in 1931, he tried to buy a candy shop with his father, which was kind of an interesting turn of events because this was during the height of the Depression. They bought the shop. It didn't really turn a profit, so they had to shut it down. So he went back into meat packing. He did it for a while and eventually worked his way up to the foreman and then manager. And with the knowledge and experience he gained, he started his own meat processing plant. See, one thing he found was that it was very inefficient the way that hogs were being shipped, across the country. You would ship live hogs from farms in the Midwest out to New Jersey to get processed. So what DeAngelis did is he set up a meat processing plant in the Midwest. The hogs came to him there. They were processed into slabs or cut into halves or whatever, and then shipped over to the coast to be sold or parted out or what have you. And this was a pretty big innovation at the time because it really saved on shipping cost. And with the price that you had paid to, say, ship one trailer car of live hogs, you could fit, 3 or 4 equivalent worth of hog meat, of butchered hogs. But one thing that really made this possible was refrigeration becoming more common. This allowed meat to get shipped over long distances and not go bad in the process, right? Now, during his meat processing time, he was involved in several scandals. One of them involved the sale of low-quality beef tallow to what was then Yugoslavia. The country itself doesn't exist anymore, but he sold it at a certain quality and it ended up not meeting standards. And then he was wrapped up in a scheme selling bad meat to the U.S. school lunch program. So we can see pretty early on in his career that he'd have this pattern of scamming and scheming throughout his whole life. And that pattern of scamming mixed with some genuine business knowledge seemed to make him a bit of a deadly threat, right? Because he could get a company and get it successful and then use the successful company to start pulling off various scams. And we'll see that as a pattern with Allied Crude. So in 1955, he leaves meat processing and goes into vegetable oils. He forms Allied Crude. He buys a large oil processing plant as well as, big fields of these 5-story high oil containers that were used for crude oil, has them sandblasted, and then has them, retrofitted for salad oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil. And here's one of the big innovations that he did within the oil market. So it used to be when they were shipping oil that they would load it into 50-gallon drums and then ship it like that. He determined it's actually cheaper just to buy an oil tanker ship and large oil tanker trucks and rail carts that were used for crude oil, sandblast them and retrofit them for cotton and soybean oil. This was a huge innovation at the time, saved a lot of money, and allowed Allied Crude to operate on razor-thin margins, right? So they started making huge amounts of money because they were able to ship oil at bulk faster and easier than anyone else. However, we'll see in just a second, this doesn't last long. The good times don't last long as DeAngelis cooks up a scheme to start getting what he considered to be free money from the commodities market, right? So commodities futures, as we all remember, they're contracts to buy or sell a certain amount of good at some point in time in the future. That's why they're called futures. And one thing that a lot of scammers and traders love about them is the amount of leverage you can get, right? You can take out a margin loan, so you're borrowing money you don't have to buy futures contracts for huge quantities, right? Because you're not actually buying and taking possession of the good. You're not actually buying the oil or the steel or the wheat. You're buying a contract which gives you the opportunity to buy that thing, right? So you're bidding on this contract, and the value of the contract comes from fluctuations in the current price of whatever it is you're dealing with. So salad oil, right? You buy a contract for 1,000 barrels of salad oil. Now, you don't actually have to fulfill the contract and get 1,000 barrels of salad oil. You can just hold it until close to expiration and then sell it off. And if the price of salad oil is up and you bought that price, if you bought that contract at a lower price, then when you sell it at market, you'll make the profit from in between the price you bought it at and the price that it's selling. However, if the price goes down, then you're going to sell at a huge loss. And this creates a lot of problems, creates a lot of margin calls, right? When the value of the positions that you hold starts to turn negative and you're on a margin, you're expected to put more cash into the account to satisfy the margin call, right? And when we're dealing with options contracts or futures, such as DeAngelis was, these fluctuations, a small fluctuation, will equal big numbers, right? Because you'll have a contract for 1,000 barrels of oil. A fluctuation of $1 in those 1,000 barrels is, going to ripple out into a huge effect, right? So what DeAngelis uses for his margin loans is warehouse receipts. That is, what happens with this is supposedly a third party comes in and verifies that you have the goods, and they either take the goods to their own warehouse, or more commonly, they lease out a portion of your oil field, for example, and hire on your workers to manage it. And, the warehouse receipt company, American Express Field Warehouse, and in this example, writes a certificate saying that you have what you say you have. It's called a warehouse receipt. They write a receipt out that says you have this, and then you can take this receipt to a bank or to a stockbroker or whoever, and you can say, hey, I've got this receipt for 10,000 barrels of oil, and I would like to take a loan against it. I'd like to take a loan against this receipt so that I can operate in the margins market, in the futures market, right? So Allied Crude, because they are a seller of oil, they are writing their own contracts for oil that they supposedly have, and then they're also buying positions in contracts for oil that they don't physically control. So we see that they're operating in this futures market in a pretty interesting way. But the side effect of this is that if you are a lender and you're getting these warehouse receipts from Allied Crude, you've got to be very diligent. You can't just trust the paper they give you. You've got to double check, because if they're getting millions of dollars from you, you need to do that diligence, right? At one point, Allied Crude starts making their own fake receipts. Tony D'Angelo apparently steals or gets a hold of a warehouse receipt book and starts printing out his own warehouse receipts. And between the different lenders that they had marketed these receipts out to, they supposedly on the books had more oil than existed in the entire oil market. No one put two and two together. I guess the data processing wasn't there at the time, but it is an interesting effect of this scam, and we're going to see a little bit more about it in detail. So here we've got our timeline, and we're just going to go through this, not exactly bullet by bullet. Not every bullet really matters, but we're just going to go through it piece by piece. So in 55, Allied Crude is formed. And for about 2 years, they're doing really good. They're making a ton of money, right? They're landing major contracts with foreign governments. They're landing contracts with different companies. And they gain a dominant market position based off of those innovations in shipping that I described earlier. But it all starts getting into the danger zone in 1957. American Express filled warehousing was in a bit of a money crunch, and when Allied Crude came to them saying, hey, we need you to do warehouse receipts for our oil, it was almost like a manna from heaven, right? Immediately, they were able to start issuing warehouse receipts for Allied Crude and begin earning huge commissions off of that, right? So that's going to be important later, right? So Amex needed the money. Allied Crude comes to them, and then they're able to start partnering up. They get a portion of Allied Crude's oil storage tanks, and then they start certifying that there's oil there. But here's where it gets, interesting, because Allied Crude, they had some oil, but they didn't have all the oil they claimed to have. They used an elaborate system of pumps and specially designed tanks to falsify the oil that they had. DeAngelis would have people supposedly sneak in the middle of the night to pump oil from one tank to the next when they knew inspections were coming. Inspectors were required to give Allied Crude 24 hours notice before they could come and see the tanks, which would give DeAngelis and his lackeys plenty of time to do any adjustments that they needed to do. In 1960, a tipster supposedly alerted American Express about the fraud. And the company at that time was making huge amounts of money from DeAngelis, didn't investigate. They let things keep going as it were and did not do any further investigations. Now, 1962, that's when things get interesting. You see, we got 2 bullet points for 62. Like I said earlier, at some point, DeAngelis gets a warehouse receipt book and starts making his own receipts. These are not audited, not verified, not that the auditing and verifying did any good due to his previous machinations to do the scamming. But he starts making his own receipts, and he's doing that because he wants to corner the market. For those of you who maybe don't remember, cornering in the market is when you get a dominant position in the market, so much so that you control the market. So he's trying to control the salad oil market, cause a shortage, drive up the prices, and get a huge reward. Around the same time, there were also problems with different grain and plant harvest in the Soviet Union. They were expecting some kind of big contract to come through between the U.S. and the Soviet Union so that we could alleviate their hardships. And that was causing salad oil prices to go up. But that contract never came through. So, 1962 is when we see that happening. DeAngelis is getting all this money through fraud, and he's buying huge amounts of oil from other parties, right? So he's not only writing his own fake receipts, he's got fake verified oil receipts, and he's buying contracts from other people to, have more oil for more schemes. So we see things are getting pretty heavy. And then what happens? That Russian negotiation for crop problem alleviations falls through, and suddenly margin calls start coming in. So as those negotiations fall through, the price of salad oil goes down and down and down, and the lenders that had lended Allied Crude all this money start calling for more money. And we're not talking a little bit of money, we're talking tens of millions of dollars, right? Tens of millions. All told, he scammed something like $120 million from different people. Allied Crude almost immediately files bankruptcy. That's on 19 November. Now, what happens 3 days later? The markets are already in turmoil from Allied Crude. 3 days later, Kennedy is assassinated. This is completely unrelated to Allied Crude, but we'll see a little bit later, and John Brooks talks about this in Business Adventures in his chapter on Ira Hopt. We'll see a little bit later that the Kennedy assassination was probably one of the things that motivated the stock exchange, the NYSE, to step in and helped Ira Hopt liquidate its materials that it needed to liquidate so that it could, pay back the people who had been scammed. A couple of years later, we see DeAngelis is sentenced to prison. He only serves 7 years, and then when he gets out, this isn't related to our topic at hand, but after he gets out of prison, he goes back to the meatpacking industry, which I'm told is full of unsavory characters, and he starts scamming again several more times. He ends up in jail a couple more times, and then, eventually passes away at old age after spending a lifetime of scamming and scheming people. So, what is the context of this? Why does this fraud matter to the field of accounting and to the field of finance in general, right? Well, Carmichael describes the type of fraud put out by Allied Crude as a financial statement fraud by external parties. So what makes that different from most financial fraud is it happens from people within your company. And that's what brings your company down. Think about Enron, right? People within Enron caused the destruction of Enron, right? But in the case of Allied Crude, the fraud of Allied Crude caused the destruction of roughly 20 other businesses, including American Express Field Warehousing, which was a subsidiary of American Express, Ira Hopt & Co., and Williston and Bean, which Ira Hopt and Williston and Bean were two rather large trading companies. They, were brokers in the stock and commodities market, and they helped move money back and forth for institutional traders and investors. Now, Ira Hopt had a long and storied history, and it had, up until this scheme, been a very, very, very successful player. So to see this one scheme put them out of business should be a shock to the market, right? Now, why is this such a shock? Well, because for Ira Hopt and for Williston and Bean, they took huge gambles on these filled warehouse receipts presented by DeAngelis and Allied Crude. They took these huge bets that basically created an external risk for their company, right? And their audits, their yearly audits that they would have received, should have acknowledged that they were in a huge amount of risk for the amount of money that they were lending to Allied Crude, right? But the audits didn't say that. So we've got these external parties doing financial fraud, harming others. And, obviously with all financial fraud, it's going to harm somebody, right? Because in any transaction, you've got two parties. But it does become a threat when you and your business are, taking huge stakes in one particular company, right? That's a very narrow type of risk. It's a concentration risk, right? You've concentrated all your eggs into this one basket, and lo and behold, it was a bad basket. So one thing Carmichael mentions is that within audit, there's a lot of talk about the fraud triangle. It was a theory put up in the 60s that says that, all frauds have these three elements: opportunity, rationalization, and incentive. But Carmichael says that onlookers, auditors, inspectors may not be able to see these three things. So if you can't see these three things, you have to focus on opportunities, right? Because you can't know if someone has an incentive, and you can't know if they're rationalizing as a fraud is ongoing. So instead, you have to focus on opportunities which are created by a lack of corporate controls. And we'll see that come up a little bit later. This talk about how corporate controls, managerial controls, enable this fraud. And, they enable the fraud for Allied Crude, but they also, for American Express, they create a situation where, they're at risk too because of this lack of controls. So this accounting problem has two major horns. Much like the horns of a moral dilemma, this has two major horns. There are the problems caused by Allied Crude, who did not have managerial or internal controls to prevent this sort of falsification of oil stocks. And then on the other side, you got American Express Field Warehousing, who did not have appropriate audit staff and training in place to accurately verify oil stock. They relied on Allied Crude's tanks and staff to verify the oil stocks. And they gave them things such as 24-hour notice. They gave them a bunch of leeway. They weren't doing their job as an audit and verification group, right? That they weren't doing their job in actually verifying that these oil stocks exist, these oil tanks were full. And that creates a huge problem, right? When you don't have the controls within your own company, and when you're American Express Field Warehouse, and you don't have these controls to ensure that your people are doing what they're supposed to, well, it can lead to all these secondary effects which harm the entire market, which harm a whole lot of other players, right? We can imagine an alternate universe where American Express Field Warehousing did have appropriate managerial controls in place, and they did have, the proper procedures in place to detect these kinds of frauds, such as surprise inspections and, not leasing out staff from Allied Crude and, perhaps not using Allied Crude's tanks if that's even at all possible. And there's a very strong possibility the scam would have been detected in the very early stages, perhaps within the first year or two, and the market would have been saved a whole lot of heartache. So going more into detail on DeAngelis and Allied Crude, we're going to do this bullet point by bullet point to just really talk about how it is that DeAngelis come through with this. Well, first he falsifies oil records, right? He's getting these false warehouse receipts. He's having tanks with these different mechanisms, right? He's using the false tanks and the seawater pumps and all that to make it appear possible. He's deceiving American Express auditors. He's using bribes disguised as commissions. And this is something that, isn't talked about much because it's kind of an uncomfortable topic to talk about. But he was paying American Express huge fees, and by some estimates, more than what a market average fee would be. Thousands of dollars weekly, tens of thousands of dollars weekly, tens of thousands of dollars a month. Sometimes these were disguised as commissions, other times as fees. And, American Express was taking these huge amounts of money, so much so that they became, one, dependent on them, but two, they loosened their guard. They thought, well, we're getting all this money from him, so, we don't need to be so distrusting. He's given us a bunch of money, so he must be on the up and up, which, it's a dangerous precedent, right? He gets the false warehouse receipt book and starts, making his own receipts. He's double dipping on loans for non-existent oil. This happens after he gets the warehouse receipt book. So he'll write out two similar warehouse receipts, supposedly for oil stored in the same location. He'll take it to two different brokerage firms and get margin loans on that same non-existent oil. He's taken loans based on non-existent collateral to fund a lavish lifestyle. So we see that with DeAngelis, at no point was this being done to, improve the business or, help the market or for some greater good. No, it was done for him, for his ego, for his own desires, right? He was a son of poor immigrant family, and he felt looked down upon by many people in society. Every time he got caught in a scheme, he always blamed it on his detractors, or blamed it on people that were trying to keep down an Italian. And I think that speaks a lot to his particular psychology, right? He was a man who wanted to be successful. He had to prove he was successful, and because he had to prove it so bad, he was willing to do so many horrible things that hurt so many people. Now, on the other side, American Express Field Warehousing isn't innocent either. Generally, a lot of these are just due to negligence, right? Again, like I said, they're getting a lot of money, so they let their guard down. They're just being negligent. They're not performing their due diligence. They don't investigate the tip of the falsified oil. When they see that they're getting lots of money, they start charging oversized fees, and they're basically taking these as bribes. And now there's some people, and this is one of those things that obviously I can't confirm. There are some people that say that DeAngelis was directly bribing, right? That he was giving money in order to get the higher ups of American Express filled warehouse and to overlook a lot of these things. That he was, just padding their pockets. That could be true. It's just there's not a lot of evidence. So that's why I put bribes in quotation marks. It could have been that American Express filled warehousing was just incredibly negligent. Maybe that's why they were struggling before. But it could also be the case that DeAngelis was, you know, putting money into their pockets. I'd say if I were a guess man, I'd say it's probably a little bit of both, right? He might have been leaving tips, he given them a tip that, would be a rather significant sum of money in order to gain some benefit from them, right? And then, as I said before, American Express filled a warehouse and failed to implement appropriate controls. And those lack of managerial controls, which, it's very important when you're running a large corporation, have these managerial controls to make sure that at every step of the ladder, people are acting appropriately. Because they failed to implement those controls, they weren't actually verifying that the oil was there, that they weren't doing what they were supposed to. And that, as we'll see, is going to lead to a lot of fallout. Now, when it comes to DeAngelis and his particular moral failings, Stotland wrote about this in a journal article talking about the psychology of scammers, and DeAngelis was one of the major scammers that he talked about. And he listed several different motivators. Most of these apply to DeAngelis. There's a couple that I don't necessarily think apply. So money, fear of loss, sense of superiority, ego challenge, power, belief they're helping the victim, and group forces, or peer pressure, as we would call it today. Now, I don't think that DeAngelis was really being affected by peer pressure. And I don't think DeAngelis really believed he was helping the victim. I mean, there's a possibility that, he kind of twisted it around in some way. And as he was giving these bribes to people, thought, well, I'm helping them out. I'm giving them a bribe, right? But I don't think he was motivated by those. I think instead he was motivated by power. He wanted to get in a position of power. It's mentioned several times that as Allied crew became more successful, he was being treated as a dignitary when he went places. He was having dinners with rich and powerful people, he is negotiating with entire countries, right? And that is a feeling of power that, anyone would envy, right? DeAngelis, we saw from his experience in the meatpacking industry that he wanted to be the dominant force, right? And we see that from the innovations that he made in meatpack, and we see that from the innovations he made in salad oil. He wanted to dominate, and part of that wanting to dominate the industry was a sense of superiority. He wanted to be on top. He wanted to be the one in power. Because I think at the bottom, he, one, loved money, and two, he was afraid of ending up back at the bottom. He was afraid of ending up being someone who had failed and who had proved these people that tended to look down on many Italian Americans at the time, that he proved them right. And I don't think that's what he wanted. I think he was definitely trying to avoid loss, and he was definitely trying to maximize his gain. So when we talk about what caused these failings, DeAngelis is the root of it all. He is the one who set off this chain of events. Now, like I said, American Express, they weren't, completely blameless. These lenders that gave DeAngelis money weren't completely blameless, but he was the one that motivated this whole crisis, right? And we see that, in several stages, lack of managerial control causes these things, general negligence causes these things. For the lenders, Ira Hopt, Williston, and several smaller firms and banks, is an over-reliance on the value of the warehouse receipts. A failure to investigate DeAngelis, right? He had been involved in a few public scandals already. And part of the reason why DeAngelis ended up dealing with Ira Hopt and Williston is because there were a lot of lenders that turned him down, right? They heard about his issues with the meatpacking industry and they kind of felt he was a bit unsavory. In some cases, that trust in your gut about someone can pay off. But additionally, you've got to try and do investigation when you can. If you're lending out millions of dollars based on the value of oil receipts, oil warehouse receipts, then you need to send someone out there and check the tanks, because that's something that Brooks talks about, is that the folks at Ira Hopped had never done a site visit. They had never actually went out to see this place. They were giving DeAngelis millions of dollars, something like $18 million, which in today's money would be closer to like $100 million. They were giving him this huge amount of money. And they didn't even send someone out there to check, right? They just took it on the value of these warehouse receipts. Now, to some extent, that says something incredible about how much trust American Express had in the mind of business leaders of the time, right? Where you get this piece of paper that says American Express on it, and you just take it as if it's, God's given green dollar, right? But it wasn't. And I think that's the difference. These negotiables, these warehouse receipts were being treated as if they were cash, but they were not cash. They're close to cash. They have a market value, but they're not cash. So what was the outcome of all this? In total, during the course of this scheme, Allied Crude borrowed something like $120 million, over $1 billion adjusted for inflation. This caused a large number of firms to suffer. Around 20 of them went out of business. Two major firms, Ira Hopped and Williston Bean, went into bankruptcy, right? In the case of Ira Hopped, the stock exchange had to step in and help. And, Brooks mentions this is a very unusual move by the stock exchange. The general sentiment of the stock exchange at the time was that no one was too big to fail, and if you make mistakes, you're going to go out of business. We're not going to help you. So for them to step in and assist as an organization, and we see in Brooks, a lot of famous names are mentioned, Chase Bank, Goldman Sachs, right? They're mentioned as, being the ones that kind of lead the charge on this, because after Kennedy was assassinated, there was a big fear that you have this oil calamity and then you have a presidential assassination, and they truly believed that this was going to lead to a second Great Depression, right? So in some ways, their actions to save Ira Hopped were self-serving, right? They weren't doing it out of the kindness of their heart. But on the other hand, it was an unusual move. It was brought about by these extraordinary circumstances. And in some ways, you can kind of see why, after the Kennedy assassination, they would go through the effort to try and save Ira Hopped, right? Imagine this, you have a large financial scandal and a presidential assassination, and the general public at the time, when people have started losing millions and millions of dollars, might think the two are related. They weren't related, right? But they might think that they're related, and that could lead to a run on the banks, a run on the trading houses, right? People wanting to get their money out immediately for fear that, it's some kind of Russian scheme. So overall, I do think it was good that the stock exchange helped Ira Hopped, but it is an interesting point in American finance history. Additionally, American Express filled warehouse and had to declare bankruptcy. And this young fella, you might have heard of him, you might not, named Warren Buffett, he gambled that, all these hardships suffered by American Express weren't going to amount to anything. He was what you call a value investor. He had studied the work of Benjamin Graham, and he thought that American Express had good fundamentals, so he was able to buy a pretty large share at the time, something like 5 or 10%. And as American Express recovered, Berkshire Hathaway, the company through which he had bought it, grew in value, right? He was able to really leverage that to gain other strong positions in the market. After this scandal happened, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, only served 7, and supposedly at one point in time he shared a cell with Jimmy Hoffa. Um, Now, is that really true? I don't know, but supposedly that's what happened. And when he got out, he went straight back to crime. He didn't learn his lesson. So I guess you, in some cases, can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it just makes you wonder about these people who kept putting him in positions of power where he is able to keep perpetrating schemes like this. Why in the world, after he had spent time in federal prison for what was essentially one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, would you go and say, hey, we're going to put you as a manager or an executive on our board? I mean, that is just wild to think about. So, within the accounting profession, this scandal is not discussed as much as other courses, as much as other scandals, and it is in some ways kind of like the forgotten scandal. When I was researching for this video, I was only able to find a handful of sources, almost none of them being modern sources. I found maybe 3 or 4 sources within the last 20 years. There was a big chunk written in the 60s and 70s, but, you know, basically nothing in between. I think that the lack of research is just due to temporal distance and the fact that the most famous book written about it was only published once. It's not been reprinted, so there's not any newer editions. I'd love to see like a newer edition of The Great Salad Oil Swindle come out that included the original text and perhaps like an examination of the aftermath. I think that would be very interesting. Within the field of audit, it's discussed in the field work stage. In the audit course I took, we talked about it during field work, right? During, not so much, well, partly for, examining the American Express auditors, but for these large financial firms, right? You're loaning out all this money on these warehouse receipts, but you don't send anyone to ever check that the oil's actually there, because on paper it appeared legitimate, but due diligence probably would have outed this scam, right? And, as I mentioned before, towards the end of the scheme, auditors should have seen the extent of the fraud, right? Because, like I said, at one point when he was writing his own fake receipts, DeAngelis supposedly held more oil than what was even in circulation in the market, which, is impossible. A good auditor might have found that, they might not, but it is one of those things that the scale of it is quite shocking. Within the profession, this really highlights the need of companies to verify individuals, right? Like if you're doing business with people, you need to check that they're not shady. You need to check that they haven't had a history of scamming, because if they've had a history of doing scams, odds are they're still going to be doing scams. I'm not saying people can't change, but I'm saying that if you are going to deal with those people, you have to have an extra level of security, right? And within financial reporting and tax, one big side effect of this scandal was based off of a court case, Zeman versus United States, which dealt with Ira Hopt writing off a bad debt expense based on Allied crude. So at the time, Hopt was suing Allied to try and recover some of these damages, and the litigation was pending. And Hopt wanted to write off this bad debt because they said, hey, even though we're in pending litigation, we have strong evidence to believe we're not ever going to get our money back because, it turns out Allied Crude only had like $5 million worth of oil, and they took out loans for $120 million. Initially, the United States said no, the government said no, and they had to take it to court, and the court ruled that they could write it off, and this became a precedent within financial reporting. So you can write off a bad debt expense even if you got pending litigation, if you are reasonably sure that even despite the pending litigation, you're not going to get your money back. So why does this matter to me? I got 4 reasons. I'll go through them one by one. One, I'm fascinated by the historical significance of this, right? Had it not been for DeAngelis, Warren Buffett would not have the fortune he has today. Had it not been for DeAngelis, Ira Hopt and Williston Bean would probably still be in business. Had it not been for DeAngelis, Amazon Express Field Warehousing would probably still be operating, right? The significance of it is important, and the lack of reporting on the fraud itself I find interesting. This is one of those frauds that I do believe should be researched more by people who are much more knowledgeable than me, by people with a much better understanding than I have. They should be researching it, writing books about it. There should be a reprinting of the Great Salad Oil Swindle. It should experience an academic renaissance in analysis. The next reason is the narrative of the fraudster and the outcomes, right? This is kind of related to the first one, but all these things are interesting, right? DeAngelis himself, interesting fellow. He is a short, fat guy with a generally friendly demeanor who is able to swindle people out of over $1 billion, right? The New York Stock Exchange stepping in for Ira Hopt, very interesting. American Express, taking great losses and Warren Buffett buying in, very interesting. The effect of Zeman and its ruling on bad debt reporting. It's still important for accounting today. Obviously, there's been additional rulings since the 60s, or well, that one happened in the 70s, since the 70s, that added more to it. But that was a first, right? That they set a precedence when it comes to bad debt reporting. And then finally, the reason I'm interested is the lesson that the scam teaches about trusting documents, right? And verifying collateral. In our digital age, we tend to want to trust things that are given to us. Someone gives you a piece of paper and you want to trust what it is, but you really do have to verify. If you're a business, if you're a lender, you've got to verify these things. If you're not verifying them, then you're setting yourself up for failure. So that's why all this matters to me. I know it's quite a lot. I find it pretty interesting. It's a big event in financial history that I don't think gets the analysis that it deserves. I really love talking about this. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I would love to hear some additional thoughts on it. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.